Welcome. In today's video, we will be discussing what is revenue per employee metric, how has the pandemic impacted this metric for some of the popular companies, how much an average employee in these companies contribute to its revenue, and finally, important things to consider when you make any conclusions based on the revenue per employee metric. Now let's get started. What is revenue per employee? Revenue per employee is a useful metric to measure average contribution of the employees to the company's revenue. It measures the productivity or production value of each employee to the company. It is calculated as total revenue of the company divided by the headcount or number of employees in the company. So whether the metric increases or decreases will depend on these two components, revenue and headcount. Now let's take some actual examples. We will use 2018 versus 2022 data in order to illustrate this revenue per employee metric and how that has changed. Here is how much the revenue per employee has changed in these companies compared to 2018 to 2022. Now in this chart, we can see how much the headcount has increased, that's shown in yellow, and how much the revenue has increased, which is shown in gray, for each of these companies in 2022 compared to 2018. Here are the 5 observations that stood out to me. Now, the first one is declining revenue per employee for Meta and Amazon. So Meta and Amazon both hired at a higher rate during this period than their revenue growth. Hence, the revenue per employee declined. Though Meta and Amazon appear to be similar here, but the underlying patterns could be different. So let's take a look at the annual trends for Meta first. It's more about the decline in revenue. So just like many other tech companies, revenue here spiked 37% for Meta in 2021, but that could not be sustained where the revenue declined slightly in 2022. However, the employee growth has continued, and the employee growth is not unusual by any standard. However, the revenue decline is causing the drop in revenue per employee. Now let's look at Amazon. So it was more the employee growth being higher than the revenue growth. In this case, 2020 was huge in terms of revenue increase for Amazon, which was a 38% increase. And then the employee growth there was 63%, significantly higher. Now, when the revenue growth slowed in 2022, Amazon also reduced the workforce by 4%, and this helped it increase the revenue per employee metric in 2022. Now, second observation is Apple's 19% improve in revenue per employee. So you can look at Apple had the revenue growth of 48% overall during this pandemic period, but increased their workforce only by 24%. So they're able to increase the revenue per employee significantly, which is 19%. Apple did not make any hiring spikes, right? So you don't see the sudden increase in the percentage hired, and that is very unique to see here. This leads to a healthy revenue per employee that they were able to retain even after the revenue growth has declined in 2022. The revenue per employee still is pretty healthy, and it's grown from 2021. Observation number 3, Salesforce's increase in revenue per employee despite high headcount growth. So despite their very high employee growth, which is 127% in this window, Salesforce managed to increase their revenue per employee. And this is because of their extremely high revenue growth. Salesforce has had very good growth in revenue every year, as you can see. And even in 2022, when it slightly declined, it's still a pretty healthy 18% increase in revenue. They've had spikes in employee growth. For example, in 2019, 40% increase, in 2021, 30% increase, but they've been able to manage them. So in 2022, the employee growth is only 8%. So that is helping them have the revenue per employee metric increase in 2022 and still pretty healthy for Salesforce given the recent history. Observation number 4. Alphabet and Netflix, both doubling their revenue and still increasing their headcount significantly. So in the case of Alphabet, 2021 was a big spike in revenue, and they had a decline in revenue growth in 2022. However, the employee growth, we didn't see any major jumps until in 2022, they've increased headcount by 22%. This led to the drop in revenue per employee, but it's still healthier than what it was before. And if I look at Netflix, some things are similar. So the revenue trend here, again, growth in throughout until it started slowing down in 2022. Netflix still had 13% headcount increase in 2022, and the revenue per employee has dropped down, but it's still healthier than it was before 2018. Observation number 5 is Microsoft. Microsoft has been unique in many ways here because Microsoft did not have any sudden increase in their revenue. As you can see here, it's pretty steady, and the employee growth has also been relatively steady until in 2022 they decided to increase their employee count. The other thing to keep in mind is that most other tech companies increased their revenue in 2021 and they saw a decline in their growth in 2022, whereas Microsoft has been pretty steady and the 2022 has been a pretty good year for Microsoft. Once again, it is as of June, so that could be playing a role in this observation here. Now, the revenue per employee has slightly declined for Microsoft here in 2022, still much healthier than it was before the pandemic. Now let's talk about how much does an average employee contribute to these companies' revenues. Now, an average Netflix employee contributes $2.47 million to the company, while an average Apple employee contributes $2.4 million. And take Microsoft as an example, $897,000 is what an average employee contributes to Microsoft's revenue. And I've also added some companies from other industry, the food service industry here, which are in yellow. Amazon is in blue because it covers many different industries. So I don't even know whether you can compare with these companies. But if you look at the food service industry, they are in a completely different range when it comes to revenue per employee. I'll be talking about that just in a minute. But here is another visual representing where these companies stand in terms of number of employees and revenue per employee. So anything that is farther to the right, if you move towards the right, that means there is an increase in the number of employees. The company is larger in terms of number of employees. If you go further up north, that means the revenue per employee is getting higher. So Apple, for example, is right here, 164,000 employees at $2.4 million per employee revenue. Now, Netflix has a higher revenue per employee, but it has only 12,800 employees. So you can see where it stands there. Now, the yellow ones are the companies in the food services industry, and you can see that they are further in the bottom left a little bit, especially bottom, because their revenue per employee is significantly lower than some of these technology companies. Now, here are the 3 important things that I want you to consider when you make any conclusions based on the revenue per employee metric. Number 1, this metric should not be used alone. So revenue per employee is a useful metric. However, you should not come to any conclusions based on just this metric. You need to consider other factors. For example, cost is not a part of this revenue-based metric. There could be the cost of goods sold, which could be a very huge thing in retail businesses. There could be real estate expenses, which play a big role in businesses that rely on physical stores. There could be human resources or salary cost, which could be much higher in the technology companies. So profit per employee could be another metric that you also consider when you're looking at using the revenue per employee metric. Number 2, consider the company's strategy when you're making any conclusions or inferences based on revenue per employee metric. So when you compare the annual trend of revenue per employee year over year for any company, you must also consider the company's strategy in the context. Reduced revenue per employee is not necessarily a bad thing. For example, you invest more money into your employees to drive revenue growth in the future by developing new products and services. So you need to invest first before you can see the revenue in the future. So during the growth phase of a new company or a company which is going into new industry, new markets, this is quite common. So investment in more employees can lead to increased revenue in future. So please consider the company strategy in the context before we make any inferences on this metric. Number 3, consider the industry and the business models these companies are in. For example, when you're comparing this metric with other companies, we have to make sure that they're all comparable companies. They need to be in the same market, providing same products and services, mostly in the same geography. Food services industry is going to have a completely different range of revenue per employee compared to technology company. The type and the skills of employee mix is going to be different for these companies. And the companies like Amazon, which is in multiple industries, it's very hard to compare against. Even within the industry, it is important to understand the business models of the companies that you're comparing with. So in the food services industry, McDonald's and Domino's are more into the franchisee model, whereas Starbucks and Chipotle are more into company-owned stores. So depending on what percentage of your business is company-owned versus franchisee-owned, this could make a big difference to the revenue per employee metric. So it is extremely important that we also consider the business models involved in the companies before you start comparing any two companies on the revenue per employee metric. I would love to hear from you, your thoughts on the revenue per employee metric and what your observations are on this data. If you would like to receive a copy of this spreadsheet that I used, please post in the comments below. So if a lot of people are interested in this spreadsheet, I will clean it up and then publish online for you to download. If there are any other questions or suggestions, please put them in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you soon in another video.